What would you do if the world was watching millions of eyes on you and someone mocked the one thing that keeps your soul alive? On a night electric with tension, under the searing studio lights of a stage built for battle, Keanu Reeves walked into a trap. He came for honest conversation, not fame or fanfare, but the host had a crueler plan. As Keanu sat, the host's voice struck like a dagger, laced with scorn. That necklace, isn't it a bit outdated for today's world? He pointed at the silver cross on Keanu's chest, a quiet emblem of faith. The audience held its breath, the air heavy with expectation. Would Keanu crumble, deflect, or unleash a truth to silence the room? Picture the scene, a sleek studio, blue lights casting shadows, the scent of tension in the air, and two men, one out to wound, the other a beacon of calm. Where are you watching from? Comment 1 foot if you'd stay silent, 2 if you'd speak up. Subscribe to Motivation for Success for stories that ignite your spirit. Let's uncover how Keanu turned a moment of cruelty into a lesson that changed us all. Under the searing glare of studio lights, where the air thrummed with the hum of cameras and the weight of a million unseen eyes, Keanu Reeves sat in a leather chair that felt more like a crucible than a seat. The stage was a battlefield, its blue panels casting cold, ghostly shadows, the scent of stage makeup and polished metal mingling with a tension so thick it seemed to cling to the skin. He hadn't come to hawk a blockbuster or peddle a brand, he'd come for something far rarer in a world of soundbites and spectacle, a chance at honest conversation. But the host, James Holloway, had other plans, his smirk a sharpened blade poised to draw blood. The audience, a live wire of anticipation, shifted uneasily as James's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp with mockery. That necklace, doesn't that seem a little outdated in today's world? He sneered, pointing at the small silver cross resting against Keanu's chest, a quiet emblem of a faith that had carried him through life's darkest valleys. The room tightened, the silence a suffocating weight, as James leaned in, twirling his pen like a predator circling its prey, expecting Keanu to crumble under the spotlight's unrelenting judgment. Keanu didn't answer immediately. His fingers moved with a tenderness that seemed to belong to another time, brushing against the cool metal of the cross in a gesture born of instinct, a muscle memory etched into his bones from a place too deep for words to reach. He didn't fidget or avert his gaze. He didn't blink rapidly or shrink under the heat of the lights that bore down on him like a divine reckoning. He simply sat there, the stillest man in the room, a quiet island in a sea of expectation. The silence stretched on, too long for comfort, and James, emboldened by what he mistook for hesitation, pressed harder. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I've spoken to scientists, philosophers, world leaders. They've all evolved beyond things like that." He gestured again to the necklace, his words a calculated jab. "Isn't it time we moved on from fairy tales?" The audience didn't gasp, but the air grew taut, the tension palpable in the faint shuffle of shoes on the studio floor, the nervous tap of a fingernail against a phone screen, the collective holding of breath as the world waited for Keanu to break. But Keanu didn't break. He looked up, his eyes warm and steady, carrying a depth of sorrow that only a man who had walked through the fire of loss could hold. His voice, when it came, was soft but unyielding, a gentle force that cut through the noise like a river carving stone. "Have you ever lost someone, James?" The question landed like a whisper of wind breaking a long stillness, and for a fleeting moment, the host faltered. James's smirk flickered, his confidence shaken by the unexpected weight of the words, but he recovered quickly, chuckling dryly to mask his unease. "What does that have to do with fairy tales?" He shot back, his tone a mix of defiance and discomfort, as if he could deflect the question with a laugh. Keanu didn't smile. He didn't blink. His gaze held James's, not with anger, but with a quiet pain that seemed to see straight through the host's bravado. I ask, Keanu said, his voice as gentle as a prayer, because it's usually in the quiet after loss, when the crowds are gone and the house is too still that faith either dies or begins. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and the room shifted. There was no dramatic score, no swelling strings to underscore the moment, just a raw, sacred silence that seemed to wrap the studio in its embrace. You could almost smell the vulnerability in the air, the faint tang of hot dust on a microphone, the metallic scent of sweat behind the ears, and something deeper, something unnameable, that settles when someone dares to strip away the pretense and speak from the heart. James shifted in his chair, his polished facade cracking under the weight of Keanu's words. "So what you're saying, you wear that because you're grieving?" he asked, his voice no longer smug, but tinged with a reluctant curiosity. Keanu shook his head, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each gesture carried the weight of a lifetime. "No," he said softly. "I wear it because I remember." He looked down at the cross, his fingers tracing its edges with a reverence that spoke of memories too precious to be spoken aloud. "My mother used to hold this when she prayed," he continued, his voice a quiet melody of love and loss. Not just for herself, but for others, people who had wronged her, people who were struggling. Keanu's mind drifted to a rainy evening in his childhood, when he'd found his mother kneeling by her bed, the cross clutched in her hands as she whispered a prayer for a neighbor who had spread cruel rumors about her. He'd asked her why she prayed for someone so unkind, and she'd smiled, her eyes soft with a wisdom he wouldn't understand until years later. "Because everyone is fighting a battle we can't see," she'd said. "And love is the only thing that heals." That moment had planted a seed in Keanu's heart, a seed that would grow into a quiet, unshakable belief in the power of compassion, even in the face of cruelty. He looked back at James, his eyes unwavering, and posed a question that seemed to echo through the studio like a challenge. "You think faith is weakness," he said, his voice steady, "but what if it's the opposite? What if it takes more courage to believe in something you can't see than to only trust in what you can?" James didn't respond, his silence a tacit admission that he had no answer to give. The room seemed to hold its breath, the audience captivated by the quiet power of a man who refused to play the game of provocation and instead offered something far more profound: truth. Keanu's voice dropped lower, each word a deliberate stroke, carving meaning into the stillness. "I've seen people use that cross to hurt," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of experience. "To judge. To divide. I've also seen people hold on to it in hospital beds, in war zones, in prison cells. Not because it was magic, but because it reminded them they weren't alone." He paused, letting the words settle, their resonance filling the space like a hymn. "You see a symbol of superstition," he continued, his gaze locking with James's once more. "I see a memory. A mother. A sister. A child in pain holding on to hope. I don't wear this to convert anyone. I wear it so I don't forget what kindness looks like when the lights are off and the world is quiet." The silence that followed was not awkward, it was sacred. The studio no longer felt like a stage, it felt like a sanctuary, a confessional where something profound was unfolding, not just in a conversation, but in the hearts of those who bore witness. James broke the silence, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "So you're saying your faith isn't about being right," he said, almost to himself. "It's about remembering how to be human." Keanu nodded once, a simple gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "Exactly," he said, his voice a quiet affirmation. Another beat passed, the air thick with the afterglow of revelation. James, perhaps sensing the shift in the room, ventured one more question, his tone now tinged with genuine curiosity. "Then why do you think people hate it so much?" he asked, his eyes searching Keanu's face for an answer. Keanu leaned in, his presence a quiet force that seemed to draw the entire room closer. "Because it reminds us of who we used to be," he said, his voice a gentle lament. "Before the anger. Before the cynicism. Before the world convinced us that believing in something gentle was foolish." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the audience, through the crew, through the millions watching from their screens across the globe. Keanu stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of the moment with him. There was no dramatic exit, no mic drop to punctuate his departure, just a man finishing a sentence that had been years in the making. As he turned to walk off the stage, a sound began to rise from the audience, not a thunderous cheer, but a soft, swelling applause, the kind that starts when something true has been spoken and people don't quite know how to respond. It was the sound of hearts stirring, of minds shifting, of a collective recognition that they had just witnessed something rare and real. Keanu stopped at the edge of the stage, turning back with the smallest of smiles, a flicker of warmth in his otherwise stoic demeanor. "Being strong doesn't always mean pushing back," he said, his voice a quiet benediction. "Sometimes it just means standing still, in grace." And then he was gone, leaving the stage as quietly as he had entered it, his presence lingering like a whisper in the air. The studio was left in a state of quiet awe, the audience still processing the weight of what they had just witnessed. James sat back in his chair, his usual bravado replaced by a contemplative silence, as if Keanu's words had forced him to look inward in a way he hadn't expected. That night, alone in his apartment, James found himself staring at an old photo of his father, a man he hadn't spoken to in years, a man whose faith he'd once mocked in the same way he'd mocked Keanu. The photo showed his father kneeling in a small church, a rosary in his hands, his face etched with a peace James had never understood. For the first time, James wondered if his cynicism had cost him more than he'd realized, if perhaps the faith he'd dismissed was the very thing that could have mended the rift between them. He sat there in the dim light, the city humming outside his window, and felt a pang of regret so sharp it stole his breath. Keanu's words had planted a seed, one that would grow in the weeks to come, slowly softening the edges of a man who had built his career on sharpness. The crew behind the cameras exchanged glances, their usual chatter replaced by a hushed reverence. In the control room, producers who had anticipated a viral moment of conflict found themselves grappling with something far more profound, a moment of connection that transcended the noise of the internet age. Keanu didn't stay for an after-show interview, nor did he embark on a social media press tour to capitalize on the moment. He didn't need to. A few hours later, on his verified profile, he posted a single line that would echo far beyond the studio walls: "We don't need to believe the same things to treat each other with love." That sentence, simple yet profound, spread like wildfire, shared more than 6 million times in just 3 days. It wasn't the cleverness of the words that resonated, but their truth, a truth that cut through the noise of a world that often seemed to thrive on division and spectacle. The impact of that night rippled far beyond the studio, touching lives in ways Keanu would never know. In living rooms and coffee shops, on social media threads and late-night conversations, people began to share their own stories of faith, of loss, of the small symbols that anchored them in a world that often felt unmoored. A young woman in Chicago posted a photo of a locket her grandmother had given her, writing about how it reminded her to forgive even when it hurt. She'd worn the locket to her grandmother's funeral, clutching it as she whispered a promise to let go of the bitterness she'd held toward a cousin who had betrayed her trust. Keanu's words had given her the courage to keep that promise, to reach out and rebuild a relationship she'd thought was lost forever. A father in Texas shared a story of a rosary he'd held during his son's surgery, a tangible reminder of hope in the face of fear. He'd sat in the hospital waiting room, the beads slipping through his fingers as he prayed for a miracle, and when his son pulled through, he'd kept the rosary in his pocket ever since, a quiet testament to the power of belief. In a small village in India, a woman who had lost her husband to violence watched the interview on a borrowed phone, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a faded photograph of him. Keanu's words gave her the courage to forgive the men who had taken him from her, a choice that would eventually lead her to start a community program for reconciliation, bringing together families torn apart by conflict. In a refugee camp halfway across the world, a young man who had lost everything found solace in Keanu's message, clinging to the hope that he, too, could find a way to love even in the face of unimaginable loss. He'd fled his home with nothing but a small pendant his mother had given him, a symbol of her faith in a better future, and Keanu's words reminded him to hold on to that faith, to believe that there was still goodness in the world, even after all he'd seen. Back in the studio, the audience carried the moment with them as they left, their conversations hushed and reflective. A young man in the back row, who had come expecting a typical celebrity interview, found himself thinking about his own estranged father, wondering if maybe it wasn't too late to reach out with forgiveness instead of resentment. He called his father the next day, their conversation tentative but healing, a first step toward reconciliation that would eventually lead to a renewed relationship, one built on understanding rather than anger. A woman in the front row, who had lost her sister to illness years ago, felt a weight lift from her chest as she remembered the small rituals of faith that had carried her through her grief. She began lighting a candle each night in her sister's memory, a quiet act of remembrance that brought her a peace she hadn't felt in years. The interview became a cultural touchstone, a rare moment of authenticity in a media landscape often dominated by noise and superficiality. Scholars and commentators weighed in, analyzing Keanu's response through the lenses of philosophy, psychology, and theology. Some called it a masterclass in emotional intelligence, a demonstration of how to respond to hostility with grace rather than aggression. Others saw it as a critique of modern cynicism, a reminder that the things we mock, faith, vulnerability, kindness, are often the very things that make us human. Religious leaders pointed to Keanu's words as a testament to the enduring power of faith, not as a tool for division, but as a bridge to understanding. Secular thinkers found in his response a universal message about the importance of memory, of holding on to the things that ground us in a world that often feels adrift. In a small town in Ohio, a pastor shared the clip with his congregation, using it as the basis for a sermon about the power of forgiveness in a divided world. He spoke of how Keanu's quiet strength had reminded him of the biblical call to love one's enemies, to turn the other cheek, and his congregation left the service with a renewed commitment to bridge the divides in their own community. In a bustling city in California, a therapist played the interview for her clients, encouraging them to explore the symbols and memories that gave them strength in their own lives. One client, a young woman struggling with anxiety, began wearing a bracelet her mother had given her, finding in it a source of calm she hadn't known she needed. In a classroom in New York, a teacher showed the clip to her students, sparking a discussion about the role of faith and kindness in a world that often seemed to reward cruelty. Her students, inspired by Keanu's example, started a kindness campaign at their school, leaving notes of encouragement for their peers and teachers, a small but meaningful act that transformed the school's culture. Keanu's words also reached a group of inmates in a maximum security prison, where a chaplain played the interview during a weekly meeting. The men, many of whom had spent years hardened by their circumstances, found themselves moved by Keanu's vulnerability. One inmate, a man serving a life sentence for a crime he'd committed in his youth, spoke up for the first time in months, sharing a story of a cross his mother had given him before he'd gone down the wrong path. He'd lost the cross years ago, but Keanu's words brought back the memory of his mother's love, and he began to write her a letter, the first in over a decade, asking for her forgiveness. The chaplain watched as the room softened, as men who had long buried their emotions began to open up, their stories weaving a tapestry of pain, hope, and redemption. The silver cross, once a target of mockery, became a symbol of something greater, a reminder that faith, in all its forms, is not about having all the answers, but about choosing to believe in something bigger than oneself. For Keanu, the cross was a memory of his mother, a tangible link to the woman who had taught him the meaning of unconditional love. But for the millions who watched, it became a mirror, reflecting their own stories of loss and hope, of struggle and redemption. It reminded them that the things we carry, whether a cross, a locket, a photograph, or a whispered prayer, are not just objects, but vessels of meaning, holding the weight of our past and the promise of our future. Keanu himself remained largely silent in the aftermath, letting his words speak for themselves. He didn't seek out the spotlight, didn't capitalize on the moment with endless interviews or public appearances. Instead, he returned to the quiet life he had always preferred, a life of reflection and creation, of riding his motorcycle down empty roads and working on projects that spoke to his soul. But the impact of that night followed him, a quiet undercurrent that shaped the way the world saw him. He became a symbol of grace under pressure, a reminder that true strength is not about dominating others, but about standing firm in one's own truth, even when the world tries to tear it down. For James Holloway, the interview marked a turning point. In the months that followed, he began to soften, his sharp-edged persona giving way to a more thoughtful, introspective approach. He invited guests onto his show not to provoke them, but to listen to them, to learn from them, to create a space where honest conversation could flourish. He never spoke publicly about the interview with Keanu, but those close to him noticed a change, a quiet humility that hadn't been there before, a willingness to admit when he was wrong, a desire to connect rather than conquer. In his own way, James became a testament to the ripple effect of Keanu's words, proof that even the hardest hearts can be softened by the power of grace. The audience members who had been in the studio that night carried the moment with them for years to come, sharing the story with friends and family, revisiting the clip whenever they needed a reminder of what it means to stand in dignity. The young man who had thought of his estranged father continued to rebuild their relationship, their weekly phone calls becoming a source of healing for both of them. The woman who had lost her sister found solace in her nightly ritual of lighting a candle, each flame a quiet prayer for peace. Their stories, and the countless others inspired by Keanu's words, became threads in a larger tapestry of human connection, woven together by a single moment of vulnerability and truth. In the end, the deepest lesson of that night was not about faith in the religious sense, but about faith in its broadest, most human form, faith in the goodness of others, faith in the possibility of redemption, faith in the power of kindness to change the world. Keanu had not set out to teach that lesson, but in his quiet, unassuming way, he had done just that. He had shown that in a world that often rewards noise with attention, the quietest voice can carry the greatest weight. He had demonstrated that true strength is not about fighting back, but about standing still, in grace, and letting the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, he reminded us all of what it means to be truly human, to remember, to forgive, to believe, and to love, even when the lights are off and the world is quiet. As the reverberations of Keanu's words settled into the night, a profound stillness enveloped the world, as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. The silver cross, once a target of scorn, had transformed into a symbol of quiet defiance, a reminder that love, memory, and grace can endure even the harshest scrutiny. Across the globe, hearts stirred with renewed hope, the young man who reconciled with his father now shared a tentative smile over coffee, their bond slowly mending. The woman in India watched her community heal through her reconciliation program, tears of forgiveness replacing years of pain. The inmate clutched his mother's letter, her words a lifeline to a love he thought he'd lost. In countless homes, people held their own symbols, a locket, a rosary, a faded photo whispering vows to choose kindness, to forgive, to hold on to hope, even when the world felt impossibly heavy. The lesson of that night was clear: True strength isn't in the loudest retort, but in the quiet courage to stand in grace, to choose compassion over conflict. Keanu showed that faith, in its deepest form, is a rebellion against despair, a bridge that connects us through shared loss and love. What symbol do you carry that reminds you to choose love over hate, forgiveness over bitterness? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you found light in your darkest moments. If this story touched you, subscribe to Motivation for Success for more tales that inspire and uplift, reminding us of the beauty in our shared humanity. Join us next time for another story of resilience that will leave you believing in the power of hope. Until then, keep holding on to what grounds you, and we'll see you soon with more stories to warm your heart.